Hi, my name is Todd Stanley. I want to welcome you to another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. The topic for today's talk will be cluster grouping and how you can use cluster grouping as a method of gifted service and what that looks like. So, the first thing I want to do is make sure that I explain what cluster grouping is. So, how cluster grouping works basically is you take students of similar ability and you cluster them together. In this case, this would be gifted students. And it's done by grade level, by subject area. So, for instance, if you have 9 fifth grade ELA kids who are gifted in reading, rather than spread them out amongst 3 or 4 classrooms, you put them all in one classroom, and then you specifically try to meet their needs because they're gathered together in one spot. And then you would fill the rest of the class with not necessarily gifted kids because you only have the 9, but they would be kids who are average or above average in language arts. That the gap that the teacher is having to teach is much less. It's much shorter. So if you put special ed students in with gifted kids or low achieving kids in with gifted kids, what's going to happen is that's just too big of a gap to try to differentiate with. And so as a result, the curriculum will become watered down or will be compromised as a result. So like I said, this is a smaller range of abilities. And because of this, the teacher is able to meet the individual needs of these students. And it can work in all grade levels and all subject areas. It is a very economical way for gifted services because you don't need to have necessarily specially trained teachers or special curriculum. You just put those students together and you do offer them a different challenges than you do maybe your typical student. So you would make sure that you're challenging them in other ways, whether it's your questioning or the assessment that they're doing or things of that nature. So why should you do a cluster? What are the benefits of it? So keep in mind that both cluster and non-clusters classrooms are going to have an experience improvement achievements. In other words, when you cluster all the gifted kids, one of the arguments or one of the complaints is that, well, it's a brain drain and it puts all the good kids in one classroom and puts all the not good kids in another classroom. But that's not the case. Actually, what it does is it allows the cluster classroom to meet the needs of those individual students and even the non-cluster classroom because those students are, again, within a small range of ability. And so you can better meet their individual needs. And so in the the gifted cluster classrooms, the teachers would have to provide strategies for these high ability students. And so you would want to make sure that when you choose a teacher to teach these cluster classes, that it's not just done randomly, but you are trying to find the best fit. As teachers, we all have strengths, and we're certain populations we work better with than others, and we get better achievement with certain groups. And so, finding the teacher that moves high ability kids is the one that you want to be teaching that cluster, so that they're able to engage those students and to challenge them. And also because you have these cluster classrooms, the non-cluster classrooms now you're gonna have the ability for students who normally wouldn't shine or wouldn't have a voice to emerge because they're no longer overshadowed by the students who have the answers all the time, who are quick to give answers. So you're gonna have new leaders. They're gonna have to step up and be leaders, and as a result, you're gonna have new role models. So there are some myths associated with cluster grouping. One of those myths is that it's tracking. So tracking is when a kid at a very early age, you determine this is the ability you're at, and you're going to stay at that level through your entire school career. This is a very fixed mindset idea. And that is not what cluster grouping is at all. Cluster grouping is could vary from year to year depending upon your needs. So it's not going to be like you're in this cluster group year, grade 2, and you're going to be in it 3 and 4 and all the way up until you graduate. And it doesn't necessarily work like that. But the cluster grouping allows these students to be put with students of similar strengths. And because of that, they're able to then find like-minded individuals, and they can be challenged at an appropriate level without fear of leaving others behind. A second myth to consider when it comes to cluster grouping is that again, it's that idea of the brain drain. So a lot of teachers are concerned that when you take all the gifted kids or high achieving kids and put them into one classroom, then what is left is not so great. But that's not the case at all, for a couple of reasons. First off, like I said, role models can emerge from those classrooms because they're no longer being overshadowed. The other thing is what tends to happen when we put all mixed abilities together in one classroom is one solution is to have all the gifted students teach the students who are having difficulty keeping up. But that's a terrible idea. That's definitely not a strategy that you want to use. And the reason being that just because the gifted students may be able to learn at a quicker rate or be able to learn more does not mean they're going to be able to teach others how to do that. Matter of fact, there's going to be a certain level of frustration because these students are not getting it as quickly as them. And so it doesn't benefit either of the groups. And so you definitely should never have gifted students work with low achieving students and to tutor them or to help them in that regards within class, because neither of the needs of those students are being met as a result. So when it comes to where cluster grouping as an example of a model, so an example I'll give you is, so what we do in our district is when students in third grade who are ELA gifted, we cluster them together in a classroom in all 7 of our elementaries. Each one has a cluster with a teacher assigned who we vetted and determined was good at moving high ability kids. And they meet the needs of those kids in that classroom. And the reason for us doing that is because we have a math program already, math enrichment, that goes to a resource room, and they are getting their needs met there. But we found we had a large ELA population that was not having its needs met. And so we figured the cluster was a good way to do that. We also offer clusters at our 6th grade math level. And the reason for that is that we do have gifted services for math students. It's called our Math Plus program. And students who qualify for that are in the Math Plus program for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade years. But there are some students who don't qualify. They may be gifted in math, but they don't have the accompanying cognitive score. But we want to make sure that their needs are being met. So in the 6th grade, we cluster those students together. And rather than accelerate them like we do our Math Plus students, we enrich them. So we go deeper. We look at things at a much deeper level than they would if they were in a typical classroom. So that's the way that we cluster here. There are other models, such as the one that you see here, where you create these differentiated clusters. And as you can see in classroom A, you put the 6 gifted kids all together along with a group of average kids and a group of just below average. And what you're seeing in the gap or the band of achievement is much smaller. So teachers are able to meet the needs of those individual students. Similarly, with classrooms B and C, which are the same, you're putting high achieving kids in there with average, below average, and far below average. And that way there's not as large a gap. If you're going from gifted all the way to far below average, that's a huge gap for teachers to overcome and can be very tricky. Differentiation is a difficult enough thing to accomplish anyways, but the larger gap, the more difficult that is to accomplish. As for where cluster grouping fits in on the grand scheme of gifted services, so you can see in this pyramid, so acceleration requires that students are moved up a grade to take courses, or are the entire class is accelerated and they're doing 7th grade work even though they're only 6th graders. So that's pretty that's pretty intensive, very involving the way you set that up. Then you have your direct gifted services. We talked about the magnet program. There are resource rooms, which we'll talk about later. But these are not as involved as the acceleration, but they are more involved than your typical classroom. The cluster grouping is a low impact economical way to meet the needs of gifted students. And what I mean by low impact is it doesn't impact like the classrooms or the teachers in the regard of hurting them in any way. It does impact in that you are meeting the needs of these individual students, and so they're going to achieve at a higher level. But it's not going to be as costly as maybe as direct gifted services, and it's not going to be as involved as maybe acceleration. And then you see at the bottom of this pyramid, you have your advanced courses in differentiation. So unfortunately, in some districts, the answer is just to differentiate in any classroom. And the difficulty again there is if you don't cluster students, the gap is just really wide and it's very difficult for that differentiation to happen. So in a nutshell, that's cluster grouping. Again, we use a combination of cluster grouping and magnet program and resource room in our district to meet the needs. We have a pretty large population, and as a result, we have different needs and different ways to meet those needs. You may be in a smaller district that doesn't have that many gifted students, so as a result, you might want to cluster them, and so that it's not so you're not having a resource room with like 2 or 3 students, but instead they're in a classroom clustered together and they can work together. And so that would be the reason for doing the cluster model. The other big reason would be for economical reasons, which is not the best reason, but we do have the realities of running schools and and having to pay for things. And so by doing cluster grouping, you're not necessarily changing the structure of the way the teachers or the classes are set up. You would have had these classes anyways. You're just putting different students, clustering different students of different ability levels in that same class. And so again, it makes it easier for them to differentiate. I would like to leave you with this thought when it comes to cluster grouping and putting students of similar ability together, because there are some myths, which I've already discussed, and there's some accusations of elitism by putting all the students together who are of high ability. But I want you to look at it like this. So imagine you have a high school sports program. So, and it's the basketball program. So you wouldn't take all your basketball players and throw them onto the same team. You would divide those teams up according to skill. So you would put your best basketball players would be on the varsity team. The middling student, or the above average basketball player would be on your junior varsity team, and your students who have lower ability might be on your rec league or your rec team. And there is no one that questions this. No one says, well, a kid in the low on the rec team should be on the varsity team, so it's equal. There's never any questioning of this, because we just accept that in sports we group students by ability, and this way you're getting a better product. You're getting their individual needs met. So for instance, for the varsity team, you are able to put them against competitions that's going to make them improve even more. While on the rec team, you might have to cover more fundamentals, or you might have to do some basics because they don't have some of those understandings. And so you can, again, meet their individual needs on these teams. And yet when we do this academically, again, there's a lot of accusations of elitism and that it's not equal. But in actuality, all students have needs. And in order to best meet these needs, we have to have special services, whether it's special ed kids or gifted kids or, the average student. They have to have services that are going to meet their specific needs. And that's all that cluster grouping is doing.